وذكر فإن الذكرى تنفع المؤمنين.
Any putative definitions?
Is that another cricket term?
It's a cricket term, yeah. It's an area of the field, the pitch, just behind the batsman to his left. Every little corner of a cricket pitch, even though it's enormous, has a stupid name. Anyway, back to work. What I've been doing has been to attempt to outline the Quranic understanding of Christianity, both what Christianity was and what it should have been in the Quran's view, and then tracing in outline the story of Islam's historic understanding of the Christian religion. And I mentioned that it got off to a slow start, that the early Muslims, when they first encountered Christians, they were basically on a lower civilizational level. And when they started to debate with Christian theologians in places like Damascus, they immediately found themselves outgunned because they knew no dialectical Aristotelian logic which the Greeks and the Christians were deploying against them. And in fact, it's generally accepted now that the great trigger that kick-started Muslim philosophical theology was actually these early encounters with intellectually more advanced Christian thinkers. That's what made Muslims get into systematic theology. And then later on, as Muslims became themselves more sophisticated, you have people like Shahrastani and Ghazali producing, in many ways, at least for their times, quite objective and factually correct accounts of the Christian religion. What I want to do now is look at the story from the other side of the frontier. What was the Christian understanding of Islam? I've already mentioned that there was no scriptural foundation on which Christians could draw on. The Quran mentions Jesus and Christianity. The Bible doesn't seem to, at least as far as Christians are concerned, mention Muhammad or Islam. The initial reaction to the fact of the appearance of Islam and its extraordinary success in conquering half the world, within 100 years they were ruling an area from southern France to the west, to the frontiers of China to the east. An area much larger, say, than Alexander the Great had ever conquered. And massive Christian conversions coming in. The initial Christian response was one of complete bafflement and bewilderment, and of course a good deal of hostility. And a good deal of theological agonizing. After all, if God had finally revealed himself and his will in history, how could this sudden rolling back of inexorable, divinely willed Christian progress be interpreted? What on earth is God playing at if the fairest lands of Christianity, Syria, Palestine, Egypt and so forth, the great patriarchal centers of Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria and other places, suddenly becoming Muslim? This interrogated the Christian conscience and confidence about history in a very profound way. And the result was a very, very fierce and angry and often hateful polemic that we find particularly from the Byzantine writers. Now, the first unambiguous record we have of this polemic comes from the great St. John of Damascus. The early Umayyad state was quite open to employing non-Muslims, and in fact he held high office. He was the minister of finance for some years in the Umayyad state, whose capital at that time was Damascus. But this seemed not to have hampered his polemical activities. He was hobnobbing with the caliph by day and at night writing polemic against Islam, and there didn't seem to be a problem. And he composes the first Christian book about Islam, and it's called A Discussion Between a Christian and a Saracen. And there are two volumes of this, two versions of this have come down to us. And he makes some fairly surprising errors about Islam, and again scholars are not quite clear how this could have happened. If he was part of the royal court in Damascus, surely he had an opportunity to learn about Islam, and surely the Muslims would have ensured that he had that opportunity. Nonetheless, he makes some very basic errors. He inaugurates a very long-standing theme of Christian polemic against Islam, which continued right until the 17th century, in that he said that Muhammad had been tutored by an Arian monk, view that has no historical basis whatsoever, but it fits in with John's understanding of Islam not as a new religion, but as a Christian heresy. And for the Middle Ages until perhaps the 12th century, that was the general Christian take on Islam. Not a new religion, but a Christian heresy. So we find Dante, for instance, when he describes what happens to the prophet in hell, he puts him with Christian heretics like Pelagius and Arius and so forth. John goes on to assert that Muhammad can't have been a real prophet because he didn't work any miracles, and he even says that the Muslims actually worship the black stone, which is this meteorite which is set into one corner of the Kaaba, which marks the point at which the 7 circumambulations begin. Muslims, of course, don't worship it at all, but he seems to suggest they do. So the debate got off to a rather unpromising start, but this initial contribution triggered a very large output of Arabic Christian writing about Islam. John wrote in Greek, but the Arabs soon followed. Now this is interesting because it was politically possible to do this. There seemed to be no restriction in the early Muslim state on Christians writing very rude things about Islam and about the Prophet. In fact, Islamic law explicitly gives Christians the right to denounce the Prophet if this can be shown to be required by their theology. Nonetheless, there had to be a certain circumspection, and outside the Dar al-Islam, the world of Islam, we find a good deal of much more vituperative, hostile, demonizing literature about the Prophet Muhammad, again that continued for at least 1,000 years. So we find the Byzantine theologians ensconced in their monasteries in Mount Athos or in Constantinople, raging against Islam. And they were the first ones who said it wasn't a Christian heresy, but was a false religion. They said Muhammad was a false prophet inspired directly by the devil. Some of them said he's the Antichrist himself. They said the Qur'an is a kind of mishmash of Old and New Testament themes perverted by Manichaean notions. And this really remained the consistent Byzantine position until the final extinction of Byzantium in 1453. In the Latin West, the debate tended to be a bit more sophisticated, although unfortunately it was no less vitriolic. The tone was set by the great Christian thinker Peter the Venerable, who was abbot of the monastery of Cluny in France from 1122 until 1156. And he is the first Western Christian to be concerned to write systematically about Islam. His worry was that the Crusades had failed to secure the conversion of the Muslims. He complained that the Crusaders were only interested in massacring the Muslims or in driving them out, and they simply didn't have any institutions or apparently any desire to convert the Muslims of the Holy Land. So he launches a quite remarkable initiative, and he travels around Spain to those towns that recently had been conquered from the Muslims and where first-hand information about Islam could be found. So he's a kind of doing field work in a pre-modern but fairly responsible way, and he generates what is today known as the Cluniac corpus. This is the first collection of Christian scholarly writings about Islam. It's made up of... He came from this great monastery. It's ruined now, but it's worth visiting if you go to... it's in the Midi, the southern bit of central France. Cluny is a great, I think, Benedictine house. Very beautiful setting. And Peter the Venerable generated this Cluniac corpus, which was 12 books in Latin about Islam. And one of these, interestingly, is the first translation of the Qur'an into a European language. It's done into Latin by a certain Roger of Ketton, who is actually an English scholar. Peter the Venerable himself contributed 2 books about Islam, one of which, a particularly influential one, he called Summa Totius Haeresis Saracenorum, a summary of all the heresies of the Saracens, which remained a kind of set text for Christian studies of Islam for several centuries. So we find this Cluniac corpus being the basis of St. Thomas Aquinas' information about Islam. In fact, one of St. Thomas's best-known works, his Summa Contra Gentiles, was explicitly written as a kind of manual for Dominican missionaries trying to convert Jews and Muslims in reconquered Spain to Christianity. Now, his theory of Islam has the following 4 themes. First of all, Islam is false. It is a deliberate perversion of the truth. It is spread by a prophet who is a deliberate impostor. Number 2, Islam is a religion which can only spread by violence and sword. Number 3, Islam is a religion of self-indulgence. The Qur'an, Aquinas wrote, permits fornication and sodomy and allows believers to break oaths. Number 4, Muhammad is the Antichrist. Now, there's a truly great book about the medieval Christian understanding of Islam by somebody called Norman Daniel. It's called Islam and the West. It's well worth looking at. And he provides often very harrowing details of this kind of medieval Christian vilification of the Prophet particularly. And he points out that the demonization of Muslims could in fact be even worse than the medieval demonization of Jews, because the Jews were castigated only for their rejection of Christ's divinity, whereas in the case of Islam, to the same charge one could add a vitriol against the founder of the religion itself. Medieval Christians couldn't polemicize against Moses, Abraham and so forth, but they could polemicize against Muhammad. So we find this personal ad hominem dimension added to the polemic. Did you have a question, John?
Yes. The 4 theses went by really quickly and they
I'm
sound
sorry.
pretty seminal, so could you just
Yeah.
repeat them quickly,
Yeah.
please?
That was Thomas Aquinas. That's
Yeah.
from him. Okay.
Yeah. He says, number 1, Islam is a false, deliberate perversion of the truth, and the Prophet was a deliberate impostor. Number 2, Islam is a religion that can only spread by violence and the sword. Number 3, Islam is a religion of sensuality and self-indulgence, so that he thought that the Quran permits fornication and sodomy and allows believers to break oaths. And last but not least, Muhammad is the Antichrist. And that was obviously, Aquinas is the great towering figure of medieval Christian intellectualism, and this view was widely accepted until long after the Renaissance. Now, these accusations, similarly to the anti-Semitic accusations directed against the Jews, legitimized large-scale religious violence against Muslim minorities who found themselves under Christian rule. So the chief function of the Inquisition was the extirpation of the remnants of Muslim belief in Spain. St. Dominic himself founded the Inquisition, and St. Thomas, of course, was himself a Dominican. And this continues down the centuries. In 1687, Ottoman rule in Hungary ends, and the Habsburgs immediately bring the Inquisition from Spain into Central Europe, and they do the same thing of forcibly converting Muslims, and when they're found to be practicing Islam in secret, they are interrogated and in some cases burned. In 1552, Ivan the Terrible captures the city of Kazan, the great definitive defeat for Islam to the east of Europe. And he immediately prohibits the practice of Judaism and Islam in his domains, a law which remained in place in Russia. You couldn't be a Muslim in Russia until the time of Catherine the Great, who herself ran into the determined opposition of the clergy, who thought that these laws should be continued. And in fact, until the Russian Revolution in 1917, it was illegal for Muslims to live in some Russian towns, like the Chechen-Kapani Grozny. Muslims couldn't live within 30 miles of the city. Kazan is another example. If you go to what's left of the Muslim city of Kazan, capital of Tatarstan on the Volga, you'll find that most of Tatarstan is Muslim, but the capital itself is Christian, because Muslims were not allowed to live in the city, and it poses various electoral and political problems now. That's the mainstream of the story. However, it's not consistently grim. Sometimes one can over-demonize the traditional European persecution of the Muslims. There were contexts in Christian Europe where coexistence did take place, and which proved to Muslims that while intolerance might be practiced by some Christians, it's not a necessary, ineluctable product of the Christian faith. It's interesting that this year sees 2 anniversaries. The first is the 900th anniversary of the sack of Lisbon, formerly Muslim city, by crusaders who were sailing by and were invited by the King of Portugal to if they wanted to kill Muslims in the Holy Land, they might as well do it nearer to home. And so they suddenly turned up in the harbour of Lisbon, overwhelmed the defendants, and historians estimate that 200,000 people were killed. There's been a spate of novels in Portuguese recently commemorating this. A great Portuguese novelist called Saramago has written a book called The Siege of Lisbon, which has just been done into English, if you want to see how the modern Portuguese conscience deals with this painful anniversary. So that's a depressing anniversary, but just 2 months ago, at the other end of Europe, another anniversary was celebrated by the president of Lithuania, who attends the 300th anniversary of the founding of a mosque in the east of Lithuania, and the 500th year of the presence of Islam in Lithuania. And he noted in his speech in this mosque how there'd always been good coexistence between the Lithuanians and the Muslim minorities, never any persecutions, etc., which is more or less true. The Tatar Muslims in the Baltic republics and in Poland, where there are a lot of historic mosques as well, generally were very tolerated by the Catholic populations. So this is a warning against seeing these things as inevitable. The situation is more complex than that.
So that was the 500th anniversary?
It's approximately 500 years since Islam became a Lithuanian religion, but it was 300 years.
People, refugees from other areas?
They were refugees from this place called Kazan. The Golden Horde, which was the great Muslim political presence in Russia, was broken up by Ivan the Terrible. Some people went east and founded the Khanate of Siberia, and some went west and were given asylum by the Catholic kings of Lithuania and Poland. And there's still some today in Poland. For a while, Lech Walesa had a second in command called Bogdan Kopansky, who is actually of Muslim Polish background. And there's a new mosque in Gdansk and so forth.
Why would Lithuania be a pocket of tolerance at this time?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I think it was partly because the Muslims weren't very numerous and weren't seen as any kind of threat, and also because they were refugees from the great Catholic rival to the east, namely the wicked Orthodox, and the Catholic kings of Poland and Lithuania were traditionally very hostile to Russia, often for good reasons, and so they were seen as allies. But they were accepted into the inner circle of the Polish court. For instance, traditionally the postal messengers of the Polish royal family were always Muslims, the Tatars, because they were great horse riders. If you've ever heard of steak tartare, this rather strange raw beef. The origin of this is said to be that the Tatar horsemen on their great voyages across the Russian plains didn't have time to cook their meat, and so they would take a steak, put it under the saddle in the morning, and by the evening it was soft enough to eat. And that's said to be the origin of steak tartare. What it actually tasted like depends on how often they gave the horse a bath, I suppose. Anyway, so these communities were relatively insignificant numerically, but I think it's important to bear them in mind in case, as sometimes happens in dialogue context, Muslims seek to tar all Christians with the same brush and said it was not possible for traditional believing Catholics, for instance, to tolerate Muslims. Sometimes it could happen. What about the contemporary situation? Present-day dialogue between the three Abrahamic faiths. Well, I mentioned earlier that since 1948, serious conversations between Muslims and Jews have been stalled until there is a final just resolution of the still lamentable situation in the Holy Land. Although there are contexts where there is dialogue between Muslims and Jews, and I myself participated in them. For instance, in Oxford, we meet twice a year at the house of the Bishop of Oxford. He presides, and there are rabbis there, Muslims such as myself, Christian theologians. And one of the most consistent things to come out of these encounters, which go on all day, is that the Muslims and the Jews almost always agree with each other on theological questions. And there are one or two things that we can't agree on, but generally there's a remarkable consensus. And it's the Christians, because of the Trinitarian view of God, that seem to be out on a limb. So I mentioned this to show that there can be and there should be serious conviviality and discussion between Muslims and Jews, but it's not as frequent as it ought to be. Christian thinkers nowadays have in large part outgrown the medieval polemic. In the mid-19th century, the great sort of quasi-Christian Victorian philosopher Carlyle gave a speech in London attended by people like Mrs. Gaskell and John Stuart Mill and the intellectual establishment. And he gave the speech on the subject of the Prophet as hero. And he showed the Prophet Muhammad as a heroic figure, as an alternative model of human perfection. Although he had some criticisms to make of the Qur'an, nonetheless, since Carlyle's time, it has not been intellectually respectable in the West really to demonize the founder of Islam, as traditionally was the case. Even in the 20th century, you find some Christian theologians of a reactionary bent, including perhaps the best known of all, Karl Barth. Harking back to the old days, Barth, for instance, once famously remarked that the God of Muhammad is an idol like all other idols. Nonetheless, this is being left behind, and palpably there has been a revolution. But the key question in dialogue is always the status of the Prophet Muhammad. The Old Testament prophets, Muslims and Christians can largely agree about them. Jesus, well, there are some areas of overlap and some areas of legitimate argument. But what about the Prophet Muhammad? And a major question that's being asked among Christians is it possible to fit Muhammad into the divine pattern of salvation without dislodging the centrality of the Christ event, of the crucifixion? How can that work? Some Christian theologians have very bravely stated that yes, indeed, Muhammad was a prophet. One of the best known of these is the Edinburgh historian William Montgomery Watt, who has a 2-volume biography of the Prophet. He says, for instance, in 1991, there are grounds for holding that God was behind the appearance of Islam in order to bring something better to the people. In other words, Islam came into being not through human planning, but by a divine initiative. Particularly significant for Montgomery Watt because he remains a committed Christian. He's actually an ordained minister in the Church of Scotland. So this now seems to be possible, although there's been quite a lot of criticism from more conservative figures saying that if you accept Muhammad as a prophet, then surely you have to accept in some way the entailment of what he taught. How can you say he was genuinely inspired by God and then not follow what he taught and was doing? Watt gets around this by saying that the Qur'an is only partly from God. Some of it comes from the divine, some of it comes from the prophet's own mind. So he compares the prophet to Hosea, the Old Testament prophet whose own experiences of his private life come into his contribution to the Bible. Watt goes on to make the very reasonable point that one of the most useful ways of judging the founder of a religion is the gospel principle of by their fruits you shall know them. And he says, if we apply this principle, then the Christian appreciation of the prophet has to be a positive one. Islam has historically inspired great sacred literature, superb, uplifting works of architecture, and allowed many men and women to achieve what has to be recognized as sainthood. So Montgomery Watt is to be admired for all of this, and he's representative of a certain strand of liberal Protestant theology that is concerned to maintain the idea of the generosity and the justice of God. In previous generations, it was possible for Christian thinkers to say, because the Muslims are such a demonic bunch of fornicators and devil worshippers and so forth, they're going to go to hell. But nowadays Western theologians are recognizing that there is much of moral and spiritual value in Islam. Hence, the idea that those people are all going to go to hell and that they are following the Antichrist is no longer sustainable. So it's more or less an inevitable product of improved information. On the Catholic side, things have been more cautious but more systematic, as perhaps one would expect. One of the entailments of the Second Vatican Council was a radical revision of the traditional exclusiveness taught by the Catholic Church. Extra ecclesia nulla salus, outside the church, no salvation. This is no longer accepted. And a papal encyclical called Nostra Aetate, which came in the aftermath of the Second Vatican Council, said explicitly that Muslims, like Christians, can hope for salvation. Very major revolution, which, given the hierarchical nature of the Vatican, has managed to trickle down to parish level. What about the Muslim side? Well, in a sense, Islam has less to amend here because the traditional polemic against Christianity in Islam was less sharp than the Christian polemic against Islam. Islam has not reciprocated Christianity's attacks on its founder. It can't, because Jesus is so highly esteemed in the Qur'an. Islam has been less historically inclined to persecute other faiths. So medieval Muslim cities like Cairo or Damascus or Cordoba were full not just of Muslims but also flourishing Christian communities and Jewish communities. Whereas in medieval Christian cities it was pretty difficult to exist safely as a Jew. To exist as a Muslim or anything else was formally impossible. We find, for instance, that when the first Ottoman embassy came to Britain in the rule of Henry VIII, they were forced to submit to baptism before they were allowed ashore at Portsmouth. It was just inconceivable that there could be any Muslims in England. There's another point here, which is that historically Christianity has wished to dissociate itself from earthly politics. Islam famously involves itself in earthly politics. What are the implications of this for dialogue? Can there be a common ground? There are a number of Muslim thinkers, most recently somebody called Shabir Akhtar, who's a British Asian Muslim, who have proposed, perhaps ironically or whimsically, that the Muslim conquests of the Christian world were actually a blessing for Christianity. Why does he say this? Well, he said in the Byzantine Empire, the various Christian minorities were always fighting each other and being persecuted by the state. As soon as the Muslims arrived on the scene, that persecution ended, so they should have welcomed the thing, and that the most appropriate rulers for traditional Christians are in fact Muslims. And it's true that we find that the monasteries immediately are no longer centres of political intrigue as they had been under the Byzantines, and could get on with their more important purpose of nurturing human souls in imitation of Christ. A good example of this, perhaps the most visually spectacular manifestation of Christian monastic piety is Mount Athos, which is a promontory off the north coast of Greece. And this superb summit of Eastern Christian spirituality, which produced such spiritual movements within orthodoxy as the Hesychast movement, has about 20 monasteries, still very much flourishing. Under Byzantine rule, the abbots were constantly complaining that they were being drawn into factional infighting in the various imperial disputes in Constantinople, different monasteries supporting different contenders for the throne. In the 14th century it was ravaged. Many of the monasteries were actually burnt by Catalan mercenaries who'd been brought in by one of the claimants to the throne. When the Ottoman Turks, the Muslims, arrived in 1420 and captured the Holy Mountain, immediately it found peace, and it became the non-political backwater it had always tried to be. New monasteries were constructed under Muslim rule. The art of icon painting was resuscitated. Sultan Selim I, in fact, generously re-endowed one of the monasteries, and if you go to the monastery of St. Panteleimon today in Mount Athos, you'll see the interesting spectacle of Greek monks actually offering up prayers for the soul of Sultan Selim for having done this. So for 5 centuries of Muslim rule, the Holy Mountain lived in peace until 1912, when the Greek army finally overrun it and the Ottomans left. And just to close off this discussion of the traditional position of Christians under Muslim rule, I've got a quote which is not sufficiently widely known, which comes from the last Turkish governor of Mount Athos. He was sitting in his little konak, his little governor's house on the mountain. Not a very popular position for the Ottoman bureaucracy, because no women allowed on Mount Athos. Not even female animals are allowed there. That's been the rule ever since the Virgin Mary went there, supposedly in the 1st century. So he had to sit there and just rule. And we have this account from a French journalist who was there interviewing him, and he was sitting there puffing on his Turkish pipe, waiting serenely for the Greek police to come along and arrest him. He gave a very interesting interview, and I've translated a little bit of it, which perhaps somebody could read. Do you want to have a go? Okay. This is what he said to the journalist.
Look around you. Look at these thousands of monks. Visit their monasteries. Question them yourself. Of what, in reality, can they complain? Have we touched their rules? Have we violated their property? Have we forbidden their pilgrimages? Have we altered even a little of their secular constitution? What race, I ask you, what conqueror could have treated these people with greater humanity, greater moderation, greater religious tolerance? Under our law, they have remained no less free, indeed freer, than under the Byzantine emperors. And they have not had to endure under our domination 100th part of the devastations you have imposed on your monks in France. Allez, monsieur, we will regret our passing. Greeks, Russians, Serbs, Romanians, Bulgars, all these monks eat each other like poison. They are bound together only by their common loathing of Islam. When we are no longer there, they will tear each other to pieces.
So that was the Muslim perception of their role, particularly in the Balkans. These Christians would be at each other's throats if it weren't for the generous, tolerant Muslims holding the show together, rather as the British perceived their role to be in India. Incidentally, I should correct what I said earlier. One woman is known to have visited Mount Athos in the past 2,000 years. She was an enterprising French journalist who went there in the 1880s, and in order to carry off her disguise as a man successfully, she had her breast surgically removed before she went. And she wrote an account of the Holy Mountain, which is in the libraries you can look at if you like. But the rule today is still no women. What I want to do in the last half an hour, having talked about the historical interaction, sometimes encouraging, sometimes frankly pretty dismal on both sides, is to look in more detail at the most central issues that invariably come up between Muslims and Christians in dialogue. I've already talked about the problem that is really an internal Christian subject for Christian reflection on the status to be attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. But the other things that invariably come up in these encounters relate to the understanding of God. Islam and Judaism see themselves as upholders of the purely monotheistic Abrahamic conception. Mainstream Christianity has upheld a Trinitarian model of God, which it nonetheless holds to be an essentially monotheistic conception. How have the Muslims understood this? Well, there are going to be a number of difficulties which beset any attempt by Muslims to define the Trinity. Muslims, hopefully with goodwill, should attempt to see the Trinity as an expression, a way of understanding the divine unity. But how can they do this? And one of the problems is that there are different Christian understandings of the Trinity. In fact, one of the key issues, if not the key issue, that divided early Christianity was Trinitarian doctrine. Reading the Muslim theologians, one sometimes gets the impression that some of them never got the point about the Trinity fully. Perhaps they were impatient with it. There's an assumption amongst Muslim believers that ultimate reality has to be ultimately simple, and that any attempt to introduce a plurality or multiplicity within the Godhead is so obviously absurd and a compromise with that principle that it doesn't really need to be investigated in detail. But we also find amongst Muslim writers, even in present times, a quite sharp hostility, that Muslims are very impressed by Christian ethics, by the life of Jesus, but they really don't like the Christian understanding of God. And there are two reasons for this, I think. Firstly, the doctrine of Trinity was the most notorious point at issue between Muslims and Christians. It was freighted with very fierce passions. For the pre-modern Muslim mind, the Christian world was always associated with aberrant violence. These savages who lived to the north of the Mediterranean, who were always fighting against each other, and when they came to the Muslim world, always brought crusades, Reconquista, and so forth. That was the traditional Muslim stereotype of what Christendom was about. And the idea was that the objective of all of this was to impose the doctrine of Trinity on the hapless Muslim victims. It's recalled even today amongst Muslims in Russia that when Ivan the Terrible took Kazan, he told its people that they could only escape the sword by praising with us the most blessed Trinity for generation unto generation. And even today in Bosnia, the salute used by Serb irregulars is that. That's the salute that you'll see them waving on the top of their tanks, which is the traditional Serbian symbol for the Trinity, which is the old gesture of defiance against Muslims. So a lot of Muslim theologizing about Trinity has not been able to be particularly objective. It's always taken place against this very powerful polemical background of fear and often outright hatred. The Trinity as the very symbol of the violent, unknown other. To this distortion, I think one has to add some problems implicit in the doctrine of the Trinity itself. Islam, although it's produced great thinkers, has nonetheless tended to put fewer of its epistemological eggs in the theological basket than has Christianity. What I mean by that is that the great intellectual enterprise of traditional Christianity was always theology. That was where the bright people went. That was the queen of the sciences in the universities. In the Islamic world, and also I think for most pre-modern Jews, theology was important, but a lot of great minds also went into areas such as law and jurisprudence, and also into mysticism. So one finds in Muslim presentations of the Trinity, as I said earlier, this sense of impatience. That the idea framed at the Council of Nicaea in 315, that God is actually made up of three persons. One of those persons is further subdivided into two natures, namely the divine and human attribute of Christ. But all of these somehow resolve to authentic unity. That seemed rationally very dubious to Muslim theologians and also seemed intuitively wrong. God, as the final ground of all being, simply has no need of being so complicated. Why can't ultimate reality be ultimately simple? So these are two obstacles to a correct understanding of the Trinity. First of all, the historical political background of fear and mistrust, and also a kind of Muslim impatience with over-elaborate metaphysics. There are sophisticated metaphysical thinkers in Islam, but as I said, the great thinkers have tended to gravitate towards law and towards mysticism. Does somebody have a question? I thought I saw a disembodied arm waving. I was hallucinating. Now, these two obstacles to some extent do persist today. However, they have been dissolved to some extent. But a greater and more recent problem is that the traditional diversity of Christian understandings of the Trinity, which always made a Muslim understanding of the central jewel of Christian theology, traditionally understood, much more difficult, namely that the pluralism, that the plurality of Christian ideas of the Trinity has actually been exacerbated. One of the central debates of Christian theology in the past 100 years has been the Trinity itself. Once again, it's in center stage. And the old Chalcedonian consensus, however fragile, about the Trinity, that was shared more or less by Catholic and Protestant theologians. The Orthodox have their own views, which differ somewhat. That has now been lost. And so Muslims, looking at the incredible richness and often brilliance of contemporary Christian theological output, can simply be bewildered. What is now the normative Christian understanding of God? What do Muslims actually say then when they confront this literature? And invariably these are the points that get raised in dialogue. First of all, Muslims recognize, or should recognize, that there is hardly any tenet of Christian theology or even morality which does not depend ultimately on this doctrine of the Trinity. A lot is at stake for traditional Christian orthodoxy. The fundamental dogma of Trinity doesn't make any sense unless you also accept the doctrines of incarnation and atonement. St. Anselm, in his famous book Deus Homo, showed that the concept of atonement demanded that Christ had to be God, since only an infinite sacrifice could atone for the limitless evil of humanity, which, as St. Augustine put it, was a massa damnata, humanity as a damned mass, because of Adam's original sin. So infinite is the sin of humanity in classical Christian theology, that only an infinite sacrifice can atone for it. Hence only God himself can do it. Man cannot dig himself out of this mess. So Jesus of Nazareth was hence God incarnate, walking on earth, distinct somehow from God the Father, who remained dwelling in heaven and hearing our prayers and his prayers. So it became necessary to think of God as at least two in one, who were, at least for a while, existing both in heaven and on earth as distinct entities. So the baby in the Bethlehem cradle is, unbeknown to his onlookers, also directing every detail of the cosmos. In early Christianity, the Logos, the Word, which was the Christ Spirit, believed to be active as a principle, as a divine principle in human life, in due course also became hypostasized as the third person of the Trinity, and hence the Trinitarian doctrine, which was affirmed particularly at Chalcedon in the 5th century. And no doubt this process was shaped by the triadic beliefs which hovered in the Near Eastern air of the time. Many of the late Roman mystery religions also believed in a triune deity. Also, some of them believed in a divine atonement figure. Mithras, for instance, is an example of this. And these are the arguments that Muslims would deploy when looking at the Trinitarian thesis. Now, when I look at the evidence for this process, I have to say that I'm probably not qualified to say whether the arguments being advanced are coherent or not, because I'm not a biblical scholar, and New Testament scholarship in particular is one of the most heavily populated and brilliant domains of modern scholarship. It's calculated that a new scholarly book on the New Testament is published every 20 minutes, if you can believe that. And one of my colleagues in Cambridge, the professor of New Testament, complains to me that she simply can't keep up with all of the new, often very brilliant books that are being produced. So if she can't do it, I certainly can't, and I'm not sure how authoritative my pronouncements are going to be. But as a layman, it does seem that a kind of consensus is beginning to emerge amongst serious historians, preeminent amongst whom are figures such as Professor Geza Vermes in Oxford, who's the expert on the Dead Sea Scrolls in Britain, that Jesus of Nazareth himself never believed or taught that he was in any sense divine, that he was a second person of a divine trinity. He was a wandering, charismatic rabbi, very much a product of and in harmony with the Galilean tradition of first century Palestinian Judaism. This is what Professor Vermes has said in his book, Jesus the Jew. And it's very widely accepted, not just by British theologians and New Testament people, but also in the States. You have people like Professor Burton Mack, for instance, at Claremont in California.
Could you write the name of that?
Yeah. Professor Geza Vermes. He has several books. One's called The Religion of Jesus the Jew. One is just called Jesus the Jew. There's the third one I can't remember. He's also the most distinguished translator of the complete Dead Sea Scrolls. Though Geza Vermes' position is, as I said, that Jesus of Nazareth himself, as historians can make out, simply regarded himself as a prophet in the Jewish tradition, but would certainly never have seen himself as being divine. That was something that came into Christian belief subsequently as the result of the infiltration of Hellenic ideas of a human being being God simultaneously, which was the idea, for instance, that underpinned the Roman Empire. The Roman Emperor was also God, God incarnate, and there are various incarnationist sects that were popping up all the time in the 1st and 2nd century. And Vermes' thesis, which is, as I say, widely shared, was that Jesus, the monotheistic Jew, was eventually swamped or veiled by the influx of Gentile converts, the paradigm for whom is, of course, Paul, who took him out of his Jewish context and held him up as some kind of quasi-divine saviour figure. So that Jesus himself, if he'd wandered into, say, a great Byzantine basilica and looked up at the mosaic of the Christ Pantocrator over the altar, simply wouldn't have recognized himself there. It was a transformation that took him completely outside the bounds of what he himself imagined himself to be. Vermes in particular has been deriving his views from his studies of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are our principal source of knowledge for first century Palestinian Judaism. The Nag Hammadi Gospels, the so-called Gnostic Gospels, are also useful. Not that they shed reliable light onto the beliefs of Jesus, but because they illustrate the sectarian ambience of the time. Also archaeological work that has been done that very much strengthens Vermes' thesis. And he also uses the New Testament itself. Burton Mack, who's taken Vermes' views a little bit further, is interesting because Mack holds that Jesus actually had a scripture. And he identifies this with the source that is used by the authors of the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke, referred to by the initial Q. There's so much that is shared by those three writers that for at least 100 years scholars have recognized that those three writers had a common source from which they were borrowing. St. John's Gospel is a different type of document altogether and generally held to be somewhat later. So Burton Mack, in his recent book, The Lost Gospel, actually reconstructs this book that Jesus had and taught from, called Q. Now, why do I mention all this? Well, because I think it heralds a possible new and more hopeful chapter in the sometimes dismaying story of Christian-Muslim dialogue. What can be the Christian response to these new discoveries, to this new image of Jesus the Jew? Well, there are two basic responses that one can observe. The first is that advocated by the great German theologian Rudolf Bultmann, who said that, okay, we know that Jesus of Nazareth as a historical figure didn't really see himself as God incarnate, but that doesn't matter because God himself is inspiring the church. The image of Jesus that was intended to be taken and to inspire the church and subsequent humanity was the image that has been traditionally read into the New Testament. And so, although the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith demonstrably are two different figures, it is the latter that we should be taking seriously as the basis for our Christology. And through this maneuver, which not everybody regards as particularly persuasive, he can actually justify the retention of the entire Chalcedonian and Pauline theology. The other response, of course, is to take the new discoveries seriously and to grasp the nettle and to say that the traditional Christian views about Jesus, the old Christology, was framed on the basis of information that we now know to be flawed. That modern New Testament scholarship, the Qumran discoveries, the Dead Sea Scrolls and so forth, no longer allow us as responsible objective historians to cling to the views developed by 3rd, 4th century Greek theologians who simply didn't have access to this material. Burton Mack is a distinguished American advocate of this thesis. So also is Professor Robert Eisenman, who recently published a book on James, the brother of Jesus. Eisenman's point in this huge 800-page tome is that the early Christian community divided into two, and that the brother of Jesus, James, is referred to in the Bible as the brother of the Lord, and Protestants certainly accept that Jesus did have brothers. Catholics don't because of their doctrine of the perpetual virginity of Mary. That the original disciples of Jesus and the early Jewish Christians remained in Jerusalem, continued to worship in the temple, and retained their loyalty to the Mosaic law. Whereas St. Paul, when he travelled out to the Jewish diaspora and eventually converted Gentiles as well, introduced Greek styles of religion, deified, divinized Jesus, and this was the reason for the tension which we know, even from the epistles of Paul, existed between him and the Jerusalem Christians. And Eisenman goes on to point out that in the year 70, when the temple was sacked and Jerusalem was razed to the ground, that the original Jewish Christian community in Jerusalem was more or less wiped out. Although we find people like the Ebionites in the 1st and 2nd century, and as late as the 5th century, who continued to believe that to be a Christian you had to be loyal to the Jewish law. as Jesus himself had taught. But following the destruction of the temple, the initiative in Christianity shifted to the new Gentile believers who rejected the law, didn't see the need for circumcision or the respect for the Jewish dietary laws and so forth. And that became the form of Christianity that eventually prevailed in history and was imposed by the Byzantine Empire. That's Eisenman's view. It's also upheld by somebody called Bernheim, who's a French scholar, who provoked quite a bit of controversy in Catholic circles in France a couple of years ago, and he produced a book also called James, the Brother of Jesus, which makes the same point. And it's a very good case, and many Christian theologians are now figuring out what the correct response should be. Some, such as the British thinker John Hick, have said the old images of God and of the incarnation have to go. Clearly they are a historical product. Clearly it is illegitimate to project these Greek ideas back into the mouth of the very Jewish Jesus. We can retain Christianity, but we need to see the Trinity as some kind of symbol, poetic metaphor, rather than a realistic description of the divine nature. And John Hick, other theologians such as Don Cupit, and some Americans, to some extent somebody called Paul Nitter has been doing this as well, have been charting a post-Trinitarian Christology, which ties in, of course, with what the Unitarian movement has been saying for some years anyway. Now, I've talked about this in some detail because I think it is going to determine the tenor of Muslim-Christian relations in the decades to come and the new millennium. And I think it's a very hopeful sign, because this great stumbling block between Muslims and Jews on the one hand, Christians on the other, namely the idea of the incarnation, which Muslims simply can't digest. God cannot inhere in anything he has created. He is outside the world, transcends the world. If that doctrine is jettisoned, if the Trinity is reformulated and regarded just as a poetic rather than a literal statement, well then there really isn't too much to divide Muslims and Christians, and a new era of understanding and dialogue can hopefully unfold. Something I wanted to close on. Often these discussions still proceed in mainstream theological circles without sufficient reference to their entailments for concepts of gender. And partly because of the several female colleagues I now have in Cambridge, I've been forced to acknowledge that many of the historic injustices imposed upon women have had theological and, in Christianity's case, Christological justifications. In America in particular, there has been a group of very articulate, challenging women theologians, Rosemary Ruther being the best known of them, who have said that it is profoundly alienating to modern women to worship a male God. The Trinity, according to Ruther, and the very considerable following that she now has, is alienating to women in anything like its traditional formulation because it's so male-centered. And as another American, Mary Daly, has said, if God is male, then the male is God. This seems to be an entailment, that there is a primacy attaching to the masculine principle in the very nature, the very ground of existence, and this can be used to justify every other inequality that has unfolded in history. The Trinity has not just God the Father, but also God the Son. God has chosen a male vessel for the incarnation. And the Virgin Mary is regarded increasingly as a rather ambivalent figure, as I mentioned earlier, because of her passivity and her saintliness as a product of her negation of her specifically feminine possibilities of motherhood. So, how does Islam fit into this? And what are the implications for this of the new, still rather tentative, trend in Christology? Well, one of the things John Hick does is to point out that immediately religion becomes more accessible and less alienating to women if this traditional Trinitarian language is set aside or poeticized. God the Father is a concept that a lot of modern, not just women, but people generally cannot accept, because it does seem to impute gender to the divine who should transcend that. So we find, for instance, even in liturgy now, the Lord's Prayer is now being amended. Our Father who art in heaven, A lot of women find this difficult. And there's a new inclusive language lectionary produced, I think, by the Episcopalian Church here, very widely used, which amends this and tries to get father out of the equation. I think that the rather infelicitous alternative they propose is, "O you to whom as loving children we belong," which gets around the gender specificity, but perhaps sounds somewhat sententious and absurd. But it's being used in a number of churches. This is a live issue. What John Hick is saying, what Ruther is saying, is that we need to redefine God so as not to attribute gender to God. And where this ties in interestingly with Muslim theology is that Islam never did that in the first place. One of the differences between the characterizations of God in the Bible and in the Qur'an is that the Qur'an does not call God Father. The divine tanzih, the divine transcendence, a word which we'll be discussing in more detail next week. God as utterly other, transcendent, beyond description, beyond comparison, precludes any attribution of gender to God, really or metaphorically. Interestingly too, there is a kind of ambivalence about the gender of the divine that you find in some of the hadith literature and also in the Qur'an itself. God is described as Allah most frequently, which doesn't really look like a male or a female noun in Arabic, although it's treated grammatically as male because there's no neuter. But there is this frequently occurring word for the divine, Ar-Rahman, the all-compassionate or the all-loving. And at the beginning of the Quran, you get these words, Bismillah, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. So this is how God chooses to describe himself right at the beginning of the Quran. Now, Rahman is interesting because the Prophet himself said that this name has been derived from Rahma, ishtuqqat min al-Rahma. And Rahma is min al-Rahim. And Rahim is the Arabic word for a womb. Ar-Rahman is God in the creative aspect. Why did God create the world, according to the Muslim mystics? Well, it wasn't because he needed to as such, but because of his compassion. Muslim mystics say that he looked out upon the possible things that could exist, that were crying out to him inarticulately for him to bestow upon them the blessing of existence, and because of his rahmah, his compassion, he breathed out and the world was born. And this is called the nafas ar-Rahman, the breath of the compassionate God. That's another way of seeing the created world. In Muslim mysticism, the breath of the compassionate God is what the world is. And Rahim has a specifically womb-like connotation. As I said, it's the usual Arabic word for a womb, and so some of the theologians explicitly aver that this is a feminine possibility within the divine. God's engendering, his maternal bringing into existence of the world. We also find in a number of hadith the concept of rahmah sketched out more fully. One of the points that sometimes arises in Muslim-Christian debate is that Christianity is a religion of love, Islam and Judaism are religions of the law. And this stereotype can also be tackled by looking at this term. It's conventionally translated as the compassionate. However, it's not a very good translation. If we look at the hadith, we find that something more intimate, more warm, more loving, more maternal is definitely implied. A famous hadith describes how when the Prophet finally conquered Mecca and there was a scene of absolute confusion, people running everywhere, fearing a massacre, which of course didn't occur, he and his companions spotted a young woman who was running around crying, my child, because she'd lost her baby in the crush. And then she found the child and picked it up and hugged it to her breast. And the companions of the Prophet were so delighted to see this beautiful scene that some of them even wept with joy. And the Prophet looked at them and he was overjoyed to see their joy, and he said, Are you amazed at this woman's rahmah, her compassion for her son? I swear to you, by him in whose hand lies my soul, God shall show more rahmah to his believing servant on the day of judgment than this woman shows to her son. So again we find a kind of feminine possibility here. And again we find that rahmah is not legitimately translated or sufficiently translated just as compassion. It has this sense of personal love as well. And you won't read the Qur'an fully or correctly unless you recognize that this mistranslation needs to be corrected. There are other points that could be made in response to that particular point, such as there is a divine name, Al-Wadud, which is correctly translated as the loving or the loving kind. It's one of God's 99 names that I'll be talking about a bit more next week. So to say that Islam is not a religion of love, or Islam does not have the idea of a loving God, simply is not the case. God created existence precisely as an expression of his unconditional love. So to return very briefly before I close to this question of gender inclusive language. As I said, these new inclusive language lectionaries try to filter out this difficult word father. Whether they can actually do so or not is a serious problem. Islam, as I said, avoids this problem by not calling God father at all. Can this actually be done in Christianity without entailing actual doctrinal mutilation? Is it possible to censor out this term father, which Jesus himself appears to have used? Well, in Britain recently we had a British Council of Churches doctrinal commission on Trinitarian doctrine today, and this paper acknowledged the force of the feminist polemic, and I'll just quote to you its response. The word father is to be construed apophatically, that is, by means of a determined thinking away of the inappropriate, and in this context that means masculine, connotations of the term. What will remain will be an orientation to personhood, to being in relation involving origination in a personal sense, not maleness. That's what they say, and I have to say that I find this unsatisfactory, and so do many of the feminist theologians. You cannot have a concept of fatherhood that is stripped of all of its male connotations, because then you're not left with fatherhood. It's not even parenthood, since parenthood itself can only have two modalities. I think that the commissioners here are simply engaging in an exegetical sleight of hand. And this again may be something that's required by the whole structure of this belief system, which, as the great British Unitarian John Biddle put it, this theory is fitter for conjurers than for Christians. I think that this kind of talk, his days are numbered if Christianity is to remain morally and intellectually coherent. How it actually falls out is obviously not ultimately for me as an outsider to say, but will be resolved through internal Christian reflection. Essentially, that's all I wanted to say about this obviously complex discussion that has unfolded between these two great religions, continues to unfold, and will continue to unfold. Perhaps it's appropriate to conclude by summarizing my own personal view on this. I myself think that it is time for the religions to grow up and to transcend the old, disreputable record that they have all acquired of sniping, of polemic, of mutual demonization. The great Catholic theologian Hans Kuhn has pointed out that there can be no world peace without peace between the religions. And I think there will only be peace between the religions when we recognize that we are no longer each other's enemies. Christianity is not a major threat to Islam. Islam is not a major threat to Christianity, and so forth. The real threat that equally threatens all of the world's religions is the common spirit of negation, selfishness, materialism. That is what is really endangering religious faith in today's world. And once this realization has been made, and we have the maturity to acknowledge that we are no longer each other's enemies, when we recognize that we have our backs up against the same wall, then we will be able to use what we have in common, which is quite considerable, as a basis for creating a common front against this spirit of greed and negation which is causing so much suffering in today's world. And it's my hope and my prayer that all of us here will have the generosity of spirit and the vision to make this very important project a reality. Yes?
Is in the Quran, so when you say Allah, you use the pronoun he, but I mean that's just a way of saying it. In
That's
the Quran,
right.
how's how's Allah termed? I mean, in this translation, you have we and our. How?
Yeah. The male personal pronoun is used for God, for Allah, but the theologians and the commentators all unanimously say that's not because God is male, but because Arabic has no neuter, and it's conventional in Arabic to use the male gender for what is neuter, unless it's something neuter and plural, in which case you use the female. But I can point to you hundreds of texts, and no doubt Quranic experts like Dr. Mir can do the same, in which the theologians go out of the way to say, no, God is not male, Allah is not male.
What is this our and we?
Well, this is part of the specific nature of the Quranic discourse, that God often changes his manner of speech. Sometimes he calls himself I, sometimes we or are, sometimes he. The Quran comes at its issues from different perspectives. It's sometimes one of the confusing things for people who come to the Quran for the first time. They expect to see God always as he with a capital H. Sometimes God speaks in the first person, depending on the kind of point that's being addressed. Yes?
You had mentioned somewhere toward the end that one of the Arabic terms for God was also a word for room.
Womb. Sorry, yeah. I'm not standing in exactly the right acoustic position.
It kind of filled the same purpose, whether it be womb or room. Because when you said that, I kind of flashed on the Dalit Chain, chapter 11, where he talks about the usefulness of a cup is in the empty space, and the spokes of the wheel are really not as useful as the space that supports them, and how perhaps it's the energy between things that is the God self, or the God energy, or the creative force, and maybe that is the less gender-bound envisioning of a God force, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, that would be a legitimate way of saying it as well. But Islam generally has tried, although it maintains the idea of the transcendence of God, nonetheless it tries to retain a personal God. It's not Buddhism or Taoism. You pray to God as if you were praying to a person, even though that person is unimaginably different. So Islam hasn't gone as far perhaps as the Far Eastern religions have gone in turning God into an impersonal force. But yes, womb is the term that the Prophet himself used. This is not just a theological or mystical speculation. The Prophet himself, in a sound hadith, said that God's name, Ar-Rahman, the all-compassionate, or the all-loving, is derived etymologically from the concept of womb.
The form of worship doesn't necessarily exclude a mutual perception of that force.
That's true. Islamic worship has two registers. It has the formal salat, the 5 daily prayers, which is like an affirmation of something that's very awesome and very distant. This tanzih, the divine transcendence, otherness. But it also has the personal aspect of prayer, the dua, when Muslims raise their hands like that, Christians do it like that, Muslims do it like that, which is when you're addressing a personal God, which is petitional prayer, which is the address to the immanent God. Islam tries to recognize both of those registers. So the Quran says, "Laysa kamithlihi shay," nothing is like God. And yet it also affirms the divine immanence by saying, and God is closer to man than his jugular vein. It does these two things, and it's really for the mystics to show how those two things are compatible.
The jugular vein and the Chinese dantian, just below the belly button, would not be an uncommon comparison, perhaps. There's just a different physical location for God being that close.
Yeah.
Something else that you had said toward the end, that Islam sees God as transcendent, non-gendered. There's nothing in Christian doctrine that sees God as gendered, but rather that Jesus' formulation of a relationship with God was unto Abba or Daddy. Now, that does no doubt cause problems for feminists. I know, heaven knows, okay? But by the same token, Christian doctrine does not explicitly say God is a male. However, the language and the force of the limitations of language are the things that get us into trouble.
Sure, I think that's an important point. Certainly Muslims themselves would say Jesus cannot have conceived of God as male because he had the same doctrine as did all of the other prophets, and this must be a misunderstanding or an entification of a term that was meant as some kind of metaphor. Nonetheless, I think one has to take the feminist objections seriously, and that historically injustices have been worked on the basis of what you take to be a misunderstanding of what Jesus intended. And I'm not here to pass judgment on Christian doctrine or to say what is right Christianity, what is wrong Christianity. I'm merely pointing out certain trends that seem to me as an outsider to be moving forward and suggesting what the implications for that might be for dialogue. But I'm not suggesting what the correct Christian position should be. Yeah.
Does anybody else got an intellectual question before I ask them this now? Middle school teachers. My kids will want to know about the black stone. Right at the very beginning, you said something about the black stone, the comet.
Okay.
And I've got various different, depending on which source you read, you know, it's sent down by God to Abraham and from heaven. What's the real deal? You said they don't worship it, but basically tell them.
It's not worship. Its effective function is to serve as a marker to show people where they start the tawaf. Otherwise, symbolically, it's God's right hand on earth. And one of the things the pilgrim can do optionally is to kiss it, which is an emblem of kissing the hand of God, i.e. reaffirming the Abrahamic covenant, which is the function of the pilgrimage. The function of the pilgrimage is to show that you're part of the Abrahamic covenant and dimension of the religion. So the pilgrims ideally can kiss the stone, although generally people nowadays don't, because if you've got 2 million people in front of you who also want to kiss the black stone, you have to be a kind of all-in wrestler before you get within 20 feet of it. And
so symbolically, it is a physical manifestation of something that Allah sent to earth.
it's a symbol, yes, but it's not regarded as something that's intrinsically holy or a relic or anything like that. It's not worshipped or regarded in that way.
What you just said sort of sparked a question. I mean, any religion in its beginning is sort of controllable just from the amount of worshippers there are. And Islam now is just outrageously huge. I mean, have there been, discussions or problems with, as far as like the Hajj? I mean, it's just so cumbersome now than it would have been, 500 years ago.
The Hajj. The Hajj is overcrowded. Until 50 years ago, only about 100,000, 200,000 people did it. Nonetheless, I've done it 3 times, and it's not intolerably overcrowded. You just have to know exactly the times to go. You go at 3 in the morning rather than at 4 in the afternoon when everybody else is going. Or you do the tawaf on the roof rather than trying to get close to the Kaaba. And the Saudis do try to restrict numbers. They impose quotas on different countries. Like every year, only 100,000 people are given visas in Nigeria, for instance, and it's a similar number for Bangladesh, etc. And sometimes those countries also impose quotas because it's bad for their balance of payments to have lots of people taking money out of the country and spending it in Mecca. So there are attempts now to put a lid on it, but theoretically the Hajj could accommodate a lot more. Was that what you wanted to know? Yeah.
I mean, just from a Christian perspective, I mean, I think that a lot of the theology or the practice, the larger you get, the more, in some ways, away from the kernel, the truth, the simple truth. So I didn't know if that's happening, through the years.
One of the interesting things about the basic practices of Islam is that although they were framed within the context of small Arabian communities in the 7th century, they are all perfectly practicable today. And the Hajj is an example of that. In fact, it's easier to do the Hajj now than it was, say, 100 years ago, because you have dozens of little health clinics there, you have an airport, you have air conditioning in tents, and you can do it in style. You can live in a villa in Muzdalifah instead of a tent if you want to do that. So I think it's become easier for a lot of people than more difficult. And Muslims would hold this up as one of the proofs of the eternal validity of the religion, that despite its specific 7th century Arabian origins, it still works today, and that you can practice it in Abiquiu, New Mexico, really just as easily as you could in 7th century Medina, despite its sometimes the complexity of its rulings. I think perhaps that's enough, and I'm feeling a bit hollow. I don't know about you people.